A whisper from the CEO makes the single dad freeze. 3 quiet words that split the economy cabin like a small, unexpected gust. The lights are low. The plane hums a steady, soporific drone. Around them, strangers fumble with blankets and earbuds. Phones glow like distant stars. Teeth click from the cold. Someone's overhead light flickers on for a child. In the middle of it all, a woman in a designer coat trembles so visibly her fingers go white at the knuckles. Across the aisle, a little girl tugs at the frayed corner of an old blanket and lifts it like an offering. Jack Hale notices the whisper because every sound is sharper at night on a plane. The stutter of the air system, the rustle of plastic cups, the way a whisper slides through coughing and conversation and becomes a thing everyone leans toward. He freezes not because the words are aimed at him, but because the words belong to Clara Lane. Clara Lane of Lane Industries, a name plastered across pages and screens, the kind of name that makes GDP curves nod. Her whisper is small, almost embarrassed. "Can I slip under your blanket?" Around them, passengers split into reactions. A man 2 rows back tilts his head and smirks, his phone already half raised. Someone near the wings snorts. A woman clicks her tongue. A flight attendant's smile is thin with rules and policy. The laughter that follows is quiet, not cruel at first, just easy dismissal, until the little girl, Ella, tucks the blanket further under her chin, looks up at Jack with steady, wide eyes, and then reaches across the aisle as if crossing borders is the most natural thing in the world. Jack is a single dad who has learned to measure kindness in small increments: leftover pancakes, an extra hour to finish homework, the precise way to sew a loose button. He is also an ex-Special Forces operator who keeps a blanketed memory in the shape of a faded olive green square with the frayed edges of countless washes. He calls it nothing when someone asks. To Ella, it is our blanket. Tonight, it smells faintly of old detergent and the diesel of construction sites where Jack works long days hauling beams, fixing things, and making ends meet. The blanket, threaded with faint scuffs and a cigarette burn near one corner, is a relic and a talisman, something he keeps folded under the seat because some talismans, like old promises, are safer close. Clara Lane's hands are shaking from something beyond the cabin's chill. She has a medical sensitivity to cold. She carries in her skin a small private alarm that rings when temperatures drop. The plane's recycled air sets off the edges of that alarm tonight. Her coat is buttoned in properly because there's always been a cost to being warm that isn't money, a cost in admitting vulnerability where power usually sits. She wears sunglasses on the tray table even now, not entirely to hide the stakes of being recognized, but to shield the smallness she hates discovering inside herself.
Fame can winterproof a person in public. In private, it can leave them thinner, more exposed to cold than their wealth would suggest. The initial hush of pity and curiosity over the whisper turns sour when a man 2 rows back films. He angles his phone so Clara's face is in frame, the dim screen picking out the tremor in her jaw. "You gotta see this," he murmurs, and the clip slides into the small, hungry currents of the internet like a pebble into a pond. Comments hatch. The first wave is unthinking and sharp, mockery wrapped in jokes. Someone types a laughing face. A thread starts to form. But in the moment, on the plane, under the bright glow of a single phone, it's just a series of tiny violences. Eyes that dart away, a finger that points without permission, the flight attendant who tightens her apron strings and says, "Sir, that's..." Ella does not notice the film or the sneers. 9 years old with a braid that bounces when she walks, she sees one simple, immediate fact. A person is cold. She has learned from Jack that small mercies add to larger ones, that being ready to give what you have rarely leaves you poorer. She stands, moves with the swift confidence of children who haven't yet been taught to measure other people's value, and she holds out a corner of the blanket. It's a piece no bigger than a handkerchief, a patch of familiar fabric, but to her it's the correct answer. "Here," Ella says, offering the blanket as if offering a piece of bread. Her voice is unadorned. The cabin quiets in an expectant sort of way, because the human brain holds a soft spot for the steady kindness of a child. Jack hesitates. Hesitation for him is muscle memory, not an indecision born of cowardice but of calculation, the reflex to scan outcomes before acting. He senses the phone cameras, notes Clara's raised hand, sees the hard tilt in the faces around them. Ella looks at him. Jack remembers a long line of stakes: work the next morning, the cost of confrontation, the child's safety when strangers are watching. He also remembers the feel of cold and of being warmed by something not meant to be handed out casually. Tenderness, he decides, is not an expense. He pulls the blanket, folds it, and presses it forward. Keep all of us in it, he says softly. Clara's whisper is barely audible, the kind of sound that could be swallowed by the engine. Please, she says. The word hangs between them, a small, human petition. It's honest, and for that reason alone, it is disarming. She slides the blanket into the space between seats. The fabric makes a soft, domestic sound against the plastic tray. For a heartbeat, the three of them make a little tent. A father, a daughter, a woman who signs papers worth more than most houses. They tuck under the cloth and their shoulders angled inward, faces lit by the ghostly blue of a phone screen and the red arc of the seatbelt sign. The world narrows to breath and the cup of warmth the blanket creates.
The cabin's collective breath changes when a head leans forward. The man with the phone laughs in a way that refuses to quit. "This is something else," he mutters, fingers already uploading. People point. The flight attendant, Sarah, with sleeves rolled and kindness worn thin by decades of policy and repetitive turbulence, shakes her head slightly. "Ma'am, I can't," she begins, more out of duty than cruelty. Ella looks up at the flight attendant and holds up the blanket like a flag of truce. "It's okay," she says plainly, the kind of sentence adults would think to preface with 1,000 qualifiers. Under the blanket, sounds are muffled. The three of them hear the plane in a way the rest of the cabin does, the small mechanical groan when the air adjusts, and the soft hush of people sleeping. Jack feels Clara's breath come quicker, then slow as the warmth reaches her fingertips. He offers a dry, practical smile that does not attempt charm. It is the smile of the man who has learned what ordinary endurance looks like. "I'm Jack," he says, because names imply neighbors, and neighbors are easier to treat with decency. "Clara," she answers. The name ascribed to the woman on covers now feels smaller in the warm fist of the blanket. Her voice has a brittle tilt to it, like a lock that hasn't been turned in years. "I'm sorry," she adds before she can stop herself, a sentence aimed toward nothing and everything. Her apology is not to Jack necessarily, but to the truth that she has been hiding behind a reputation, that she thought austerity and distance were protection. Minutes morphologize into a strange kind of privacy. Conversation becomes small. Weather, the length of the flight, a joke about how the blanket has its own flight status. The better part of the cabin watches as if peeking through blinds. The man who filmed them notices the Blorm quiet, feels his phone adrenalized by potential views. He posts the clip with a caption that at first reads like an editorial glare, the kind that invites clicks more than compassion. Within moments, a thin thread of comments spirals away, swift and sharp. The first responses are symptoms rather than judgments, emojis, a laugh, a call for theater. But then something else begins to happen in the stream below the clip. Tiny changes in tone arrive like the first drops before rain. Jack tells a brief story, not a full memory, not a parade of medals, but a quiet account of why that blanket matters. He speaks in the language of people who understand scarcity, not of glory, but of survival and of simple care. "This one came with me," he says, touching the cigarette-burned corner, his thumb tracing the ragged thread as if testing its durability. "It kept my buddy warm when he couldn't keep himself, worth more than any coat when you're out there." He doesn't say where out there was. He never adds specifics. There is no swagger in his voice, only the steady cadence of someone explaining how something useful became something holy. Clara listens with the attention of someone rediscovering a human fact that somehow escaped her world. Suffering is not always tabloid-worthy. Sometimes it is simply the raw business of staying alive. Her fingers curl tighter into the fabric, and her lips press together, because women of power are rarely taught the vocabulary of being grateful without obligation. "Thank you," she says. The words are small. The cabin, which had been a hungry theater earlier, tilts toward stillness. But people are complicated things. The clip has already begun its small migration across the networks, the fragmentary world of strangers' attention. Comments proliferate. Some mock, some marvel, some make jokes that sit badly in the throat. A wave of scathing humor is common currency online. It gets traction fast. The man who uploads it notices the rising numbers, and for a moment feels the cheap warmth of noticing. Then he sees one comment that is different. An older handle, neat handwriting and text, posts that mention a name and Ghost Wolf. It is a name that people like Jack rarely say aloud, but once uttered, it reverberates. General Briggs stands up when he hears it. He is an older man, seatbelt across his lap, a crumpled cap on his knee. For a moment he is just another traveler, with the soft hose of the oxygen mask box and a folded cane. Then he leans forward, mouth moving with the slow, deliberate care of someone pulling a thread from a sweater. "Ghost Wolf," he says, a note of recognition in his voice. The name is older than the current internet. It sounds like an old radio call sign, clipped and exact. The cabin, half asleep and full of glow, goes quiet again, because the sound of a general speaking has a way of making small rooms feel like court. Jack, who has been unwrapping the blanket, straightens. He knows that voice. Some lines in a life are thin and persistent. Recognized names are one of them. The general's face, a map of lines and decades, holds a kind of permission that flattens judgment. He asks Jack, quietly enough that it stays intimate for them, but loud enough for the Rose to overhear. Hale? His accent is roughened by years of authority, softened at the edges by time. Jack Hale? Jack nods, and a silence follows him like the end of a song. There's no dramatic raising of a flag, no shout. General Briggs tells the cabin a short, true, unembellished sentence. He saved a life once. Not headlines, not medals. A life. The words are plain, but they are a pivot. People are quick to mirror leadership. When a respected voice offers context, the room leans to listen. Immediately, the atmosphere changes the way light does when it hits an old mirror. Reflections rearrange. The smirks soften. The man with the phone lowers his hand. Businessmen with folding newspapers fold them back over like shutters.
The anger of amusement ebbs into something larger and more complicated. Recognition reframes their laughter into a shadow of regret. But the real shift comes a moment later when Clara reaches into her purse. She has an old photograph wrapped in tissue paper, a small, faded image with a scrawl on the back, a caption kept inside a journal. This photograph had lived in a place reserved for things that mattered, the little container where people keep relics that smell of memory. She hands the photograph to Jack without comment, as if the action does not require preamble. He unfurls the image and sees a younger man holding a blanket over a wounded figure, a picture that could have been 1,000 similar images from different places, except for a note on the back in a handwriting he does not recognize, but the words of which land like a small, warm stone. For the man who kept him alive. As Jack looks up, Clara's face shifts in a way that is both surrender and recognition. She says, voice thick, "My father wrote about a soldier with a blanket. I never thought... I had stories. I kept them. I never..." The sentence breaks under its own weight. She reaches for Jack's hand under the cloth. The contact is simple and human and urgent. Something in the air retunes. People who had been strangers find themselves tethered to this moment. The man who filmed the clip feels the weight of his action like a sudden public heat. He deletes the post with 2 shaking thumbs, and then posts an apology that reads more honest than most contrition posted for likes. "I was wrong," he writes. "This should have been our care, not our headline." Comments reply in acceptances and in relief, the online echo translating into real gestures. Sarah, the flight attendant who had initially hesitated because of training and rules, crosses the aisle with the easy steadiness of someone who has watched many human dramas land in her aisle. She offers a blanket from the storage bin, not the softest, not the prettiest, but warm in a way the cabin recognizes. "Sorry," she says to Clara and to Jack and to Ella, as if the apology is for the accumulated slights that pass through 1,000 flights. Her voice is practical and sincere. No grand statement, only a small mending of public space. General Briggs tells a short memory, careful not to turn service into soap opera. He speaks of a night that required less detail than gratitude, how a man had chosen to shelter someone when it would have been easier to move on, how the value of that choice became a thread that altered outcomes. He does not paint Jack as a mythic hero because Jack insists he is not, but in the telling, people hear the sound of a life that had once given protective shelter in a landscape where shelter meant something concrete and literal. It reframes the blanket from an old rag to a token of quietly given courage. Clara's hands shake as she opens her bag and produces a slim fountain pen with a small chip. "This belonged to him," she says, holding it out. "He believed in handwriting. He believed in notes. There is no corporate magnet grandiosity here, only the private residue of a daughter's grief and devotion." Jack takes the pen with fingers that have known calluses and the feel of a tool. He does not say he doesn't deserve it. He only nods and tucks the pen into a pocket where old receipts and a folded photo of Ella live. Jack takes something out in return, modest and meaningful, a pair of dog tags worn smooth at the edges. He does not kneel or preface with rhetoric. He slides them across with the casualness of someone restoring a balance. "For memory," he says, "so you don't need a photograph of someone else to remember him." The tags clang softly in the metal tray, a sound like keys. Clara holds them as if discovering that something thought lost is present again. She presses them to her chest, and a minute later the cabin feels somehow less brittle. Ella, who has been at the center of this small human arc with the unsentimental clarity of children, produces a crayon drawing, a house with a plane above it, and 3 stick figures beneath a blanket labeled "Blanket Family." Her drawing is earnest and oddly profound in its simplicity. She hands it to Clara like a peace treaty. Clara's hands that had been steady enough to sign contracts and tender enough to sign condolences fold the paper with a tenderness that draws a quiet murmur from those around them. Outside, the sky begins to hint at dawn. The engines hum a lower, steady song. The 3 of them, a single father, his daughter, and a CEO who had whispered a plea, sit closer than the flight plan might have intended, bound by a transient intimacy that strips public identities down to the common denominator. People who had watched the clip and smirked now offer blankets from their own overhead bins, a patchwork of comfort that arrives like a late blessing. Apologies ripple through the cabin, short and sincere. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have laughed, I didn't look." Those sentences are small stitches, but they add up to something larger than any headline. When the plane finally touches down, sunlight is soft and tentative, spilling slowly into the windows like an apology that has had time to think. The terminal yawns, busy with the business of departures and arrivals, of lives zipped into luggage. As they disembark, the three of them walk side by side under the warm, low light of the concourse. People stare for a moment. The public expects drama in predictable forms, but this is quieter, less showy. It is a small human procession. They pass through the sliding doors and into a morning that feels different from the night that birthed it. In those first steps out of the plane, strangers offer smiles that carry the weight of two things: recognition that they had been wrong, and the small social courage to admit it.
A woman with a stroller gives Ella a candy wrapper and a shy thumbs up. A businessman returns the pen he had taken for an autograph earlier and says, "No, keep it, and keep caring." The man who filmed them walks past without his phone raised, eyes lowered in something like contrition. He stops, finds Clara, and offers a handshake that is clumsy and human. "I ruined it," he says. "I didn't mean to. I'm sorry." Clara accepts his apology with a grace that surprises even her. She is not diminished by admitting a mistake. She is remade by it. "We all wander small," she says, and the phrase is as understated as a closing door. Her father is a ghost that had sat in her private archive until this night gave him a body in the memory of another man. She hugs Jack and Ella with a warmth that is not a transaction. She gives Jack the pen and takes the dog tags with a tenderness she wears openly now. "Keep them close," she whispers, and the words sound like a benediction. What follows on the networks is not instant. The clip spreads, but the commentary shifts. People repost, but now with context: the general's confirmation, the photograph, the apology. Those who had clicked first for the easy laugh find themselves reading the thread and moving their reactions to something else: admiration perhaps, or at least the slow, awkward correction of conscience. The man's original post is deleted, and his apology climbs alongside other posts. The narrative that began with ridicule softens into something that admires the quiet logic of being kind. Later, as the sun lifts higher, Clara invites Jack and Ella to a small coffee near the terminal. The invitation is more than diplomacy. It is an attempt at repair made real by shared muffins and awkward small talk. She listens to Jack tell of his workdays, the honest fatigue in his voice. She watches Ella draw another picture on a napkin and tuck it into her bag. They exchange numbers in that nervy, practical way adults do when they mean to mean something but fear promising too much. Clara's assistants will worry about optics. She will worry about warmth. They both worry about different things, but tonight their worries are braided by a small human thread. There are no grand declarations between them, no instant friendships forged by a single night. But there are promises, uneven, human, and honest. Jack says he would like to keep the pen because it matters, and Clara says he can visit a small foundation in his name if he ever wanted to help others the way his blanket has helped. She does not try to erase the inequality between them. She acknowledges it and chooses to use what she has not as a wedge but as a bridge. Jack gives her the dog tags back with a firmness in his hand that suggests trust more than need. Ella gives Clara another drawing, now titled Our Warmest Day, and Clara pins it to the inside of her planner like an emergency contact for a human heart.
As they part, General Briggs finds them and clasps Jack on the shoulder. "You kept someone alive," he says again, but with a different cadence now, one that flares with gratitude, not obligation. "You did what needed doing. That's all any of us ever ask." Those words are small, literal, and enough. That night, as Jack tucks Ella into bed at their small apartment, she asks a question that is both childlike and unavoidably true. "Daddy, did I do a good thing with the blanket?" She asks because the world has been quick to judge, and she needs the mirror of a parent's approval. Jack sits at the edge of her bed, the lamplight painting the room in gentle yellow, and he thinks about cold and warmth, about the way people hide, and the way they reveal themselves when given a chance. "You did," he says finally. He thinks of Clara's whisper and the way it made him pause, of the general's voice and the way other people's stories can land in a life like a new map. He thinks of the pen and the dog tags and the drawing now pinned to Clara's planner. He thinks of how small acts ripple. "You did more than good, kiddo," he adds, smiling despite the strain at the edges of his mouth. "You reminded people how to be better." There is a curve in Jack's life that no one else sees, the part where he had to teach himself to be a parent, to forgive his own mistakes, to imagine ordinary days as triumphs because they were steady and true. At the window, he watches a plane cross the moon and disappears into cloud. He wonders about Clara's future gestures, about whether she will change anything larger than a schedule or a public statement. He does not hope for grand miracles. He hopes for the small, stubborn continuance of compassion. Days later, the public story refracts into smaller pieces. The initial viral clip is now the hinge of a narrative where kindness beats cynicism. People write op-eds that praise the change of tone. Others write long, small thank you letters to service members and single parents and the invisible people who keep cities functioning. The man's apology post gets reshared more times than his original mockery ever did. Clara uses her platform in a single quiet step. She posts a simple photograph of the crayon drawing Ella made, credits the child, and thanks those who offered apologies. Her post doesn't sell a product, it sells an idea, humbly framed, that warmth is a form of charity we can all afford. The ripple continues. A small non-profit evening program that Jack had once heard of but never visited receives a donation tagged in the wake of the story. Volunteers arrive at a local shelter carrying blankets that look suspiciously like the kind Jack had kept in his car. The conversation shifts in the town square and near coffee shops. People begin to speak in the soft, surprising way of those who have seen better models, apologizing where they might have judged, sharing where they might have hoarded, paying attention where they might have schooled.
Jack walks a little differently after that. Not because he thinks the world has become newly virtuous, but because he senses that a fissure has closed in a public seam. The world is still complicated, but he keeps his blanket folded a little differently now. Clara and he exchange occasional messages, not long eulogies of friendship, but the kind of short, human notes that matter. She invites him to an event where a minimum of money and a maximum of intention will aid families like his. He goes, not for applause, but to stand in a room where people are trying to remember the human part of policy. Ella grows a little more secure in the knowledge that when you do what is kind and true, it has a way of returning in unexpected shapes. She learns that generosity is not the preserve of the wealthy, nor the special preserve of the heroic. It is something you hand a person like a spare sock, a cup of warm soup, a corner of a blanket. The real change is not in a single tweet or pen stroke, but in a dozen tiny exchanges that follow the moment of the whisper. A cashier gives an extra sample to someone who looks tired. A neighborhood man helps an elderly woman with bags. A flight attendant finds a way to bend a rule for a person who needs it. The seeds are small but fertile. The city breathes a little differently because a story reframed an instant of dismissal into a lesson on communal dignity. Weeks later, Jack finds himself at a small event with Clara Speaks, not as a CEO offering a pardon for the past, but as someone who learned the vulnerability in admitting mistakes. She thanks Jack for something he never asked for, the permission to be human in public. She does not attempt to make herself smaller to appear humble. She simply speaks of the necessity of warm gestures in a world optimized for efficiency. Her tone is candid. She mentions that for a long time she thought coldness was a form of control. Tonight she says plainly, she understands that what seems like distance can be loneliness dressed up in a suit. After that night, their lives do not merge into a tidy storybook. Jack keeps working his shifts. Clara returns to the responsibilities that shaped her life. But there is reciprocity now, small and predictable, the kind that does not make headlines because it belongs to the messy interiors of people's days. Invitations to meetings, offers to fund a local after-school program, a note from Clara's assistant suggesting a collaboration on winter gear distribution. Jack reads them with a detached caution. Then he makes choices that feel like slow, sensible investments in community rather than in spectacle. The man who filmed the clip becomes a softer version of himself. He speaks at a small panel about the power of online accountability and the importance of thinking twice before pressing post. The narrative has humbled him in a public way. He uses that humility to speak in schoolrooms about bystander behavior and online responsibility.
Notably, he never pushes Victor's stories. He speaks of change as boring and necessary, rather than dramatic and masculine. Clara's father, the man whose handwriting had once tucked a note about the soldier with a blanket, becomes a larger presence in memory. The pen she had carried now sits on Jack's workbench among tools, a quiet object that makes him pause before fastening a bolt. He takes it out sometimes to write a quick list or to sign a check for Ella's school trip. Each time he uses it, he thinks of the small human chain that led to the pen being in his hand. Ella continues to grow, to ask questions and to draw. She learns that her choice was not a spectacle, but an ordinary act of decency. She learns that the courage to reach across aisles is not only for headlines, but for mornings when someone is cold and needs a patch of warmth. She keeps a corner of that blanket under her pillow for years, a soft talisman that smells of cookies and old diesel, and the scent of a world that can be less rough because people choose otherwise. A month later, Jack finds himself pausing at a small memorial bench in a park, fingers resting on the dog tags he carries now in his pocket. There is no grand meaning to the act, only the human need to mark a line. He thinks about cold and the way it makes you remember what is important. He thinks about Clara's whisper and the way it caused him to stop and consider his own borders.
He thinks of General Briggs's voice in the cabin and the way recognition can reroute a crowd. He thinks of Ella's drawing pinned to the inside of Clara's planner and the strange ways favors travel, as drawings, as pens, as tags. In the quiet at the edge of the park, Jack says aloud, not to call anyone back from memory, but just to solidify the small truth. Warmth wins. It is not a boast. It is an observation. The sky is thin and blue. A breeze moves across the bench like a page turning. Months later, in a note that is passed around among friends and volunteers, someone writes, "Real wealth is what you give each other." It becomes a phrase that people use when they want to make a modest point, not a slogan to be sold, but a compass. Clara, in a small speech for a charity that supports veterans and low-income families, repeats the line, then gives credit to a little girl and a man who just did what was kind. The audience applauds in a way that is not performative. It is a room of people who have decided to rewire their reactions. Jack's life proceeds without fanfare. He still fixes things, still carries coffee like a sacrament, still tells Ella to brush her teeth and to be careful crossing streets. He occasionally lets a conversation about the viral night wander into something mildly awkward, the way memories sometimes do. He refuses, gently, to become a symbol. "I was a man with a blanket," he tells an interviewer once. "I did what someone else might do. It just turned out other people saw it."
Don't make a saint of me. Be one yourself. But in the quiet after the commotion settles, when the city slows and people return to their regular lives, the small human changes remain. That is the most remarkable thing, that a whispered request about warmth could cause a single night to bend toward more warmth in a way that accrued, day by day, into a new habit. People learned to apologize a little faster. A cameraman learned to lower his phone before hitting upload. A CEO learned that vulnerability is not a liability but an invitation. A single dad and his daughter learned that small offerings can move mountains of shame. Jack keeps the photograph Clara had given him in his wallet, behind the folded receipt from the bodega where Ella buys gum. Some evenings, when the apartment is quiet and the television hums like a distant ocean, he takes it out and smooths the edges. It reminds him that names can be small, and that saving a life does not always come with medals, just with the ongoing duty to be a decent human. He looks at the dog tags and fingernails traces the letters until it feels like Braille, a tactile proof that simple things can anchor a person. In the end, the thing that changes everything is not the viral clip, nor the public confession, nor even the exchange of tokens. It is the whisper itself. Clara's tiny admission of need that cut through the ambient noise and invited a stranger to respond with basic human generosity. That small act lit a sequence of decisions: to be kinder, to apologize sooner, to share blankets. It turned a harsh laugh into a shame that led to action. It turned a businesslike life into a life touched by tenderness. Jack thinks about the night often. Sometimes he narrates it to Ella in bed, emphasizing the smallness of the original act and the largeness of what followed. Sometimes he tells it to himself while standing on a scaffolding with tools at his belt, working in the sun. In those moments, he is both ordinary and remarkable, a man who knows the worth of a warm thing and the low price of offering it. On a morning when the light is flat and the city smells of rain, Jack takes a pen from his pocket and makes a list of things he wants to teach Ella: to fix a leaking pipe, to stand up for a friend, to be brave enough to be kind. He draws a small picture in the margin, a crude stick family under a blanket. He tucks the list into his wallet, next to the photograph and behind the dog tags. They are small artifacts of a life being lived. He smiles, not because he imagines fame returning, but because he knows the world can, in small increments, be better. The plane that night was only a single crossing of sky. The whispers we make are the weather of our everyday lives. A politician's speech may sway a city. A whisper under a blanket can change the way a dozen people apologize and 1,000 more think. None of the change is perfect. Power still complicates things. Pain still exists.
But between a daughter offering a frayed corner and a woman in a designer coat admitting she's cold, something shifted. Jack watches Ella grow, and she watches the world with a new kind of hunger, not for attention, but for the infrastructures of care that make a life bearable. Clara keeps the crayon drawing in her planner for months, and sometimes asks to see Ella on purpose. They exchange messages that are human and small and true. In the final light of the story, Jack's voice comes back in his own head, softer now, older by a few worry lines, and less prone to abruptness. He thinks of the night the whisper made him freeze, of the way the world had rearranged because a child did the simplest thing. You know, he thinks, the biggest victories aren't trophies or medals. They're the ones that warm cold hearts. They're the ones that keep people from wandering alone in the night. If this moved you, share it, because true wealth is the warmth we give one another.